Good morning, everybody. I'm Tony Lathrop. I think I know most or all of you. Welcome this morning, and thanks everyone for coming to this meeting of the UDO Advisory Committee. I want to especially thank first all the community members of this committee for all that you have done, all that you continue to do, and that in advance for what you will be doing to help us craft this process and craft this ordinance. Simply couldn't do it without you, and the feedback and input and engagement is remarkable. Thank you very much. And you know, the process that we have for this has just been great, and I want to thank the Laura and Alan and Allison and all your team for all that you all are doing to make this such a inclusive and rigorous process. Thank you very much. I think that it is obviously we've made great progress over the relatively long period of time we've been doing this, but I think it's been and continues to be a true model for engagement for how to do these processes, and is a really shining example to the world and the country of the best way to do this. And I think everybody should be really proud of that, both from just the process standpoint of it, but also from the substance of what it is enabling us to accomplish. So thanks for the engagement, and thank you all for the time. And I know we've got a busy agenda today, and I know we have several new folks. I want to welcome you all and turn it over to Allison Craig to give a few other introductory remarks and specifically highlight and welcome our new members today. Allison.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate your leadership and your thoughts. It's great to have you as chair of this committee. Wanted to take a moment to welcome two new members of the UDO Advisory Committee. So we've got Ishmael, who is representing the Charlotte Housing Justice Coalition. So welcome, thanks for joining us. And Melissa, who's representing the Community Benefits Coalition. So great to have you on board, and welcome to the group, and look forward to a great discussion today. Also wanted to take a moment to recognize two planning staff. Lorena, you've probably seen on these calls before. She's been with planning for about a year, and she has been helping out with website and communications and graphic design. We've realized with all of the hard work that planning's doing with the comprehensive plan and the UDO that additional communication support was needed. So we've Yolanda joined the team last Monday to provide some additional support there. So you'll be seeing both of those individuals here with us in this group, just in helping us communicate. Sometimes, particularly on the regulatory side of things, it can be very confusing and challenging to be able to translate that to everyday talk. And so we'll look forward to Yolanda and Lorena really helping out in that way. So we've got some pretty dense material today, I think, with stormwater regulations. And so I just want to reiterate that your comments and your feedback are much welcome and needed, and really crucial to the success of this effort. So please don't be shy to jump into the chat and discuss and ask questions or provide comments. So thank you for your work, and I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Allison. So we were planning on live streaming this to our YouTube channel, but hit a bit of a technical difficulty. So we will be doing that at our next meeting. We'll see kind of what happened with this one. So look forward to that. But in the meantime, we are also recording this, and we will be posting this on the UDO website for anyone who wants to go back and look at this again, or other folks in the community that want to watch this process. Again, the process as we have worked before is we'll have presentations for you guys. You can put questions as we're going through into chat. And so, or when we get to the point where we'll be stopping for questions, you can certainly raise your hand as well. Excuse me. We will spend time at the end, between sections of the presentation. And we are focused on stormwater today. We're moving into that section. So we have a number of folks from the stormwater group with us. And in addition, I want to make sure everyone knows Andrew Ossel. He will be managing the discussion about the questions, but he has also been the lead in planning, working with folks from Stormwater Services and Louisa with the county on the stormwater components. This will be the first of 2 stormwater meetings that we're going to have. And we'll be sending out a survey after the second meeting. And with that, I'd like to hand this actually off to Jordan Miller, who is going to start the presentation, and he is with Stormwater Services with the city.
Thanks, Laura. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, thanks. So yeah, my name is Jordan Miller. I work in the City of Charlotte Stormwater Services Department, and I implement the city's post-construction stormwater ordinance, just as a reference. So the little bit of lead into the talks today is that we're a city of streams, as we like to call it. This is a picture of a project that was completed a few years ago in the Briar Creek Chantilly area. And this is just a reminder that we are a headwater city. And so we have many streams, small and large, that drain to 2 different river basins in Charlotte. So a little bit about stormwater services. One of the responsibilities of our group is to manage the city's MS4 or Municipal Separate Stormwater System permit, which is a requirement under the Clean Water Act. And one example that we want to point to here is the map that shows the red line streams, which are considered impaired based on federal use guidelines. The blue streams that are shown there are not necessarily not impaired, they're just not monitored by the federal government or the state of North Carolina. So pretty much anywhere in the city that you live or work, you drain to an impaired stream. So that's kind of the take-home message with this map. And the other photo there is just to remind folks that most stormwater runoff goes directly to the stream, untreated or undetained. So there is a lot of potential for pollutants and the like getting into the stream system and to the lake system. Just a little bit of connection to the folks that are probably familiar with the comprehensive plan and obviously the UDO process. So the comprehensive plan, I'm sure y'all seen this slide before, is going to lead into the UDO, which will end up grouping all of these existing regulations and ordinances to one location. The 2 that I'm going to talk about are the 2 in the balloons there that are currently housed in the zoning ordinance, the surface water improvement management buffers and the water supply watershed. And then David and Jay are going to talk about floodplain regulations and erosion and sedimentation control. And this is just sort of a word cloud. It's not intended to read the whole slide here, but these are just some elements of the current draft of the comprehensive plan that touch on efforts to mitigate problems related to stormwater runoff and some of the city's goals, both current and in the future, once the comprehensive plan is completed. So I kind of touched on this with the comprehensive plan, but here are the elements in the stormwater and natural resources section of the UDO, or that will be. SWIM being the first, and then water supply watersheds, both currently in the zoning ordinance. Floodplains will be brought in from a different section of city code, as well as soil erosion sedimentation control from chapter 17. And we got 3 more sections that we won't cover today, 2 of which being stormwater there in the kind of grayed out section. So 2 of those will be at the next meeting, I think. So all that lead into this first ordinance, which I've already mentioned several times. It's a mouthful. You can go to the next slide. So the section outline for swim buffers is we've got a purpose, applicability, some standards and buffer delineation, mitigation requirements or processes for impacting these buffers, and then appeals and variance, so mostly administrative section. And this is very similar to how this this section of the zoning ordinance is currently outlined. So just a little bit of background for those on the call who may not know what a stream buffer is. So the main goals of a stream buffer are to protect the areas outside of the actual stream itself and provide some filtering capacity, some wildlife habitat. You want to provide some shading to reduce temperature within the stream itself, which also leads into additional habitat, and then provide some stability through root mass of trees and other vegetation along the banks of the stream to prevent erosion. And so if anybody's in the GIS real estate or just likes looking at their house on Polaris, you've seen probably these squiggly lines before and maybe wondered what they are. So these are all the different stream buffers that exist in the city of Charlotte there in the legend. The specific one talking about here is the 3 green ones, and that's the swim buffer. The current regulations went into effect in 1999. And it applies to intermittent and perennial streams that drain at least 100 acres of drainage area. So most of those are delineated fairly accurately in our GIS applications. So folks can usually know if there may be a potential swim buffer on their property or on their potential site. And the widths vary from 35 to over 100 feet. And really that depends on how much area is draining to that stream and how close you are to the floodplain. So here's a good depiction. You can see the photo on the right that shows what this looks like in the field. And then these are the different zones that swim buffers are broken up into. The stream side zone, the managed use zone, and the upland zone, all measured from the top of bank, which would be field located. And those zones basically have different intended goals and vegetative targets, as well as disturbance allowances. So as you move closer to the stream, what you may be allowed to do within that zone would be reduced the closer you get. So this is kind of the main take-home message from this talk, other than sort of the background on swim buffers, is the main changes. And honestly, there aren't a ton currently proposed for the swim buffer chapter or article. And the biggest differences are moving this from the zoning ordinance to a more appropriate section of the UDO. And then also removing some older exemptions that made sense in the 90s when this was being developed, and now are either never used or don't make sense based on current regulations or the way things are developed in today's time. So just mostly removal of some redundant and outdated exemptions. And then a lot of cleanup of languages and definitions. What we called things in 1999 is different than what we call them today. So just trying to align the language across stormwater regulations, and then hopefully, as much as we can throughout the UDO as well. So there's less confusion on what things mean. And then kind of speaking to the definitions and language, same kind of thing with the regulations themselves. These some of the guidelines and policies have evolved over the last 20 years. So just baking that into the UDO to make things consistent across different ordinances that may have similar requirements. Just hoping to make it a little bit more user friendly. And then the last one is a little bit more down in the weeds, but as I mentioned, there's a mitigation section where you can impact sections of the buffer and provide mitigation to reduce the impacts on the environment. And so we had, I'll just say we had 8 mitigation options, and we're removing some of those that are honestly never used. So just trying to clean up and minimize some over wording as much as possible.
Awesome. So we'll pause for questions or comments. I don't see any in the chat right now. If you do have a question or something you want to bring up now, you could feel free to unmute as well or drop it into the chat. But we'll, if there are no questions, we'll let Jordan continue on. Next, we'll talk about watersheds, but we can pause. I don't see anything. Jordan, it's all yours.
All right, so it's crystal clear. So the next section is the water supply watershed protection section, and that's also currently in the zoning ordinance. Here's an outline. So very similar. You got a purpose and applicability sections. This one's a little bit different, and I'll talk about this in what we anticipate changing from the current regulations, because there's 3 different areas and sub areas within those that were established based on proximity to the Catawba River Lake system. And then there's a uses section and development standards, and then some regulations relating to high density development, and then again, more of an administrative section about appeals and variances. Here is a picture of one of the intakes along the Catawba River and Lake system. So, if you don't know, most Charlotteans who aren't on private well get their drinking water from one of the intakes along Mountain Island, Lake Norman, or Lake Wiley system. So this is one of the intakes there. And so two of these 3 areas are required under state law to have these protections in place. And it's really to limit the amount of pollutants and things that get into our drinking water supply, which obviously makes it easier to clean up for us to use for drinking water in an uncontaminated fashion. And this one's a little more wordy. You can see the colors on the map there. There's several areas, and they're dependent. Again, you can kind of see the proximity to Catawba River, which runs along the western border of Mecklenburg County. How, as you get closer, we call it a critical area versus further away is a protected area. And the 3 watersheds within Charlotte's jurisdiction are the Mountain Island Lake and sort of the pink. Actually, that looks like it's, green. And then the Lake Wiley, which was also called the Catawba River in the current regs, in the pink. And then the lower Lake Wiley, which is more the brown color. And these had effective dates, the first 2 in 1993 and the lower Lake Wiley in 2001. So again, some fairly old regulations. And the requirements of this section are similar in fashion to the swim buffer section, because they do have stream and lake buffers to provide the same kind of benefits that a swim buffer would. But they apply in different scenarios than swim would, mainly relating to the watersheds. And then there's also built upon area limits, which built upon area is similar to impervious area, rooftops, gravel, driveways, sidewalks, those kinds of things that limit the rain's ability to penetrate into the soil. And then also stormwater management requirements. So building structural stormwater control measures on site, like a pond or some sort of filtration device. And really the big changes here are mostly structural. The current zoning ordinance has 3 sections that apply to these 3 different areas. And what we've done is combine those into one under the stormwater and natural resources section. So, and we've aligned a lot of the, language. Instead of having 3, repetitive sections, we've combined those and only flagged the differences that may occur between different areas. So it's hopeful that it will be, number one, a lot shorter, a lot more user-friendly. And then converting a lot of text into tables, which, are much more easy to read. And then cleaning up language, much like we're doing with SWIM, 25 to 30-year-old regulations, where we want to make sure we align our definitions and language across the UDO as much as we can. I think the next slide kind of shows an example. So this is an example in a draft, of course, but you can see on the left, that's just half of what's shown in the table. There's actually a whole nother section that's also included in this table. So the goal is to really take a lot of this language that can be somewhat confusing and put it in a very easily read table, so that folks can use the ordinances much more easily. And that's all I got for that, Andrew.
Thanks. Anything that jumped out to folks, questions, concerns? Admittedly, there's a lot of pretty simple updates in these articles. So, we're still working on the drafts. We don't have a polished version yet to share, but there are a lot of concepts in there that maybe triggered a question or two. If not, we can move on, but we'll pause for a second. Okay. Well, thanks, Jordan. We will turn it over to David Good.
Good morning, everybody. I am David Good, and I'm also with Stormwater Services. I administer the floodplain ordinance for the city of Charlotte. This first slide, I'd like to talk about just basically, for those of you that are not really familiar with this type of work, the purpose of the floodplain ordinance is essentially to reduce the impacts of flooding to people and property. The floodplain ordinance is a requirement. You have to pass a floodplain and adopt a floodplain ordinance with certain standards if you want to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So in other words, in order to provide flood insurance policies to the folks in the floodplain in Mecklenburg County, we have to have a floodplain ordinance. And so the NFIP has certain minimum requirements and to be a participant, but the city of Charlotte and our ordinance contains those minimum requirements, but also the city of Charlotte ordinance has several higher standards. So we go in Charlotte, we go above the minimum national standard. What you're looking at here on the left side of the screen is a snapshot from a floodplain map. And the floodplain map is used for both floodplain regulation, for building and construction, and also for flood insurance purposes. That is a dual purpose. And this floodplain map is showing, this is an area on Mallard Creek, right at I-85. And what you're looking at, the dark blue area on this map is the floodplain that we use for insurance purposes. And there's a line, it's difficult to see, but there's another line on outside of that that's wider than our predicted than the flood insurance floodplain. It's a little bit wider, and we use that for regulatory purposes. And basically what these two floodplains are is our best estimate of what flood levels would be if we had a large event, a large storm event, what we call a 100-year storm. And the blue area is that event based on existing conditions. So if we had a 100-year storm today, we estimate that it would cover this area. And that outer floodplain is the area that we think would be covered 20 years from now, let's say, when the watershed is fully built out. So the blue area is for insurance purposes, but we use the other area, the outer larger floodplain, for regulation. So if you wanted to build a house or a commercial building or any sort of structure in that area, then the floodplain ordinance would apply. Okay, so the first two items I discussed are two sections of the ordinance. This is just a list of other sections in the ordinance, sort of the structure of the ordinance. And we have general floodplain regulations that apply across the board. And then we have specific floodplain regulations that only apply when you're doing certain work. So they're very specific to a type of work. Just like the other ordinances, we have appeals and variances. We handle those. We have enforcement so that we can enforce the ordinance. And we have a long list of definitions. It's a definition intense ordinance. So here's a list of the proposed changes. And it's a list of, there's 5 items on this list, but really most of these changes are just, they're sort of incorporating the way we have done business historically as far as regulating the floodplain. They're just making, they're making clarification and organization change, that sort of stuff. The first item is the state of North Carolina has a model floodplain ordinance, and that if you have to adopt at least this minimum standard in order to be part of the NFIP, and they promulgate that ordinance. The last ordinance revision we had for the floodplains was in 2018, and they've made some changes to that model ordinance in the last 2 years. So we're gonna align the current ordinance with the model ordinance in some ways. The second item I'll go into in more detail has to do with, as I said before, we use that future conditions floodplain, that wider floodplain, to regulate development in Charlotte. And so we need to take some actions to tweak that floodplain. And I'll talk about that later. Item 3 is we're going to talk about a couple of variances that we need to change, just to essentially, like I said, to incorporate into the ordinance the way we already do business. Auto adoption is the 4th item is auto adoption. Then we've got some reorganization and clarification changes. Okay, the second item had to do with, and this is the most, I guess, interesting change, but the second item on my list had to do with future flood levels. So we're talking about that wider floodplain. Mecklenburg County began mapping our own floodplains in conjunction with FEMA back in the late 1990s as a result of some floods we had throughout the mid and late 90s. We decided to take on the remapping effort. And so working with FEMA, because it's FEMA's, like I said, FEMA uses these maps for flood insurance purposes, but we also use it for regulation. And so the floodplain maps were updated by the county in 2004. And when we updated the maps, we added that future conditions, that bigger floodplain, to the maps in 2004. And the goal for the future conditions floodplain mapping, and it was to try to determine what's going to be the largest extent of flooding. If we were to build out every watershed or individual watersheds in Charlotte, they may be imperfect. They may have very low, density now, but they may have higher density in the future. So we're trying to predict what the maximum flood elevation would be, and then regulate such in a way that buildings would have, for instance, the lowest floor in the building would be above that flood elevation, so that we don't have the situation where a building's built low, and then as a watershed develops and the flood elevations rise, that building's first floor is below the flood elevation, and it's subject to impacts from flooding. So a couple of years ago in 2017, 2018, we had, over the years, we have remapped this area over the years. Since 2004, we've done, I guess, 3 phases since 2004 where we remapped the areas, and that's what this map is showing. We remapped areas, and we started with phase 1, and we moved to phase 2 and phase 3. But basically what we did is we updated all the maps. And in that process, we found that the future flood levels were pretty variable when we would compare the remapping effort to the former mapping effort. And so we needed to take a look at that. And we took a look at that situation in 2018. So what we found, we hired a consultant or the engineers, and we did a study. And what we found out is previously how we tried to estimate the changes in the flood levels was we would use just land use particularly. So we would look at planning reports and try to determine where in a watershed there would be more development over time. And we would use that to try to predict what the future conditions flood elevation would be. And what we found was it was more complicated than that, as you can imagine. And so we looked at climate, physical environment, regulatory issues, and just some overall programming issues and how we do our floodplain models and calibrate our floodplain models. And we found out that, we really needed to tweak the way we do our future conditions flood estimates. And so once we completed the study, we formed a stakeholder group to talk about this potential change in the way that we map the floodplains in Mecklenburg County. And the stakeholder group was composed of a diverse group of individuals. It was staff, and representative from the environmental, real estate development, and engineering communities. We met from April to August discussing the various ways we needed to change the way we remap the future conditions floodplain, and came up, the stakeholder group came up with a recommendation, which was presented to the Stormwater Advisory Committee, which is our advisory committee that for all things related to stormwater. They made the recommendation that in order to assure that we're not building buildings too low, we would add another foot to, if you want to think of it this way, to the level in which we require a house or any building to be built. So right now, the way it works is we take the future conditions flood elevation, or what we predict it to be, and add a foot. And if you were to build a house in that area, you would have to build the lowest floor to that elevation, 1 foot. What we found during the study of the future conditions floodplain is that that flood elevation is about a foot low. So in general, some places it's not, and others it is, but in general, it's about a foot low. So the recommendation was made that what we would do is add another foot to that elevation. And we would only add it until we get an opportunity to remap those areas. And then when we remap those areas, that foot will no longer apply. So that was the future. That's probably the biggest change. The variance reduction change is we have 2 provisions of the floodplain ordinance that are subjects of a request for a variance, typically about 4 a year. And the 2 provisions are dry land access and parking. Dry land access is a provision that just allows, the purpose of it is to have an access to a building from a street, hopefully a dry street, it's not covered during the flood, that's above the flood protection or above the flooding elevation, so that during a flood, emergency responders can get from the street to the building without having to go through floodwaters. So, and the other provision was that we have that's sort of related is parking. So for the parking and for everything except for single family residential, parking has to be above that flood level too, at or above that flood level, so that cars don't get, swept, don't get flooded and don't get swept away down the stream during a flood event, large flood event. So what we're doing is for both of those provisions, we have in the past agreed to the variance if certain conditions applied. So we would impose those conditions on the property owner. And instead of requiring the property owner to go to the zoning board of adjustments and seek a variance in the future, we just decided to incorporate all of that into the ordinance. So if those conditions apply, then they no longer have to go seek the variance. Auto adoption of floodplain maps. The floodplain maps are, we do the mapping, but we do it in conjunction with FEMA. So FEMA has to, they oversee our map production. And in the end, technically, FEMA has to issue the map. So they'll issue the map once they've vetted the map, made sure everything was correct. And there's a long legal process associated with that also. They will issue the map. And in the past, the state legislature required us to, when the maps were issued, we would have to go to city council and ask city council to adopt the maps. And they would have to adopt the maps before they were official. The state legislature changed that legislation last year. And now if we put a provision in the ordinance, we don't have to go to city council. As soon as the day that FEMA issues the maps, they're adopted. And this last is just a long list or a list of the reorganization and clarification that we are proposing to do. And really, except for the 1 foot increase in freeboard, all of these provisions are, or most of the, I guess, most of these, if not all, are consistent with the way we're doing business now. We're just codifying the policies into the ordinance. So and we're changing definitions, for instance, to match how we basically run the ordinance now, or how we do business now. So the only two, I guess, added provisions are the 1 foot increase based on that future conditions flood study. And also there's another administrative provision that has to do with houses that when they're flooded, if they're flooded, like for instance, if a house is not currently compliant with the floodplain ordinance, so the lowest floor of that house is below the flood elevation, and it is involved in a flood, and the flood damage to the house is more than 50% of the value of the house, then that homeowner is required to bring that house into compliance with current ordinance. And so the last administrative bullet down there has to do with that. So it's a little bit, it's a somewhat of a change of the way we're doing business. But otherwise, most of these are just clarification and codification of how we do the other policies that we have in place now.
All right, thanks, David. Any questions? I didn't see any in the chat. Yeah, admittedly, there's a lot of just kind of updates being made. You know, we just got done with the zoning ordinance and talked about a lot of substantive changes and, you know, different approaches. But I think in general, what you'll find is that this is a pretty consistent carryover from what we have in the ordinance today. But if there are questions, let us know. We can also connect offline if you want to have a conversation that's maybe a little in the weeds, because generally, you know, these issues can get kind of dry and in the weeds. But something from Eric. All right. Any additional planned future studies after the 2018 study? I think that's probably for David.
Yeah, we're planning to, well, I'll put it this way. Currently, in the budget we have for next year, we have money to begin the remapping process again. Now that's based on, the budget hasn't been approved yet. But if the budget were approved, then we're setting aside money to begin the remapping process again, beginning in next year. So if we follow the path that we followed in the past, then we would start with the first section that we remapped in the last remapping effort, and we would begin there and start remapping there. Even if if the budget's passed and we start next year, the maps wouldn't be ready. It's a long process until FY 26 or fiscal year 26 or 20 to 28. It'll take a little while, but that is the plan. The plan over the long haul is to begin remapping as long as we have the budget.
Thanks. Second question is from Dave Wiggins. Will there be any requirements in the UDO that land or easement in undevelopable buffers or floodplain must be donated to Park and Rec for use as greenways? And then the second is, are greenway donation requirements only part of conditional rezonings? Any thoughts on that, David?
Well, I know that I'm not aware of any that the floodplain, there would be any requirement related to the floodplain as far as Park and Rec's concerned. I'm not aware of any.
Yeah,
Just
and
on
there
the floodplain part of it, I'm not aware of anything like that.
yeah, there is a floodplain buyback program, right? There's
There is a
programs and
definite,
stuff.
yeah, we definitely have a buyback program. And what that is if you have a structure that's what we call non-compliant, and especially if that structure has been flooded repeatedly, we have a program where we purchase that property in that house. And we demo that house as part of our flood mitigation efforts. We definitely have that. But I'm not aware of purchasing land for, floodplain land for park and rec, other than, if we buy the land using the flood mitigation, for instance, the flood mitigation grant, and we buy the house that's non-compliant and we demo the house. I mean, park and rec can obviously, put a greenway, for instance, across that property. That happens. So, but it's Mecklenburg County land at that point. We bought it, we own it, and so that is common for park and rec to put greenways across that land.
Thanks. Hopefully that clears up your question, Dave. The next one's from Warren Cooksey. Given the federal and state directives regarding today's topics, how much local discretion is really available for the contents of the ordinance? So, for example, what would be an example of a choice available to City Council regarding today's topics? So kind of like what you were saying, Dave, there's a lot of FEMA requirements. There's a lot of state requirements as well. Maybe are there any areas where City Council has some discretion, or can they exceed standard? What are some things that they can do?
Right. The way the model ordinance works is that there are minimum standards for participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, but we're allowed to exceed those standards. And the best example I have of that thought process or that policy is in most places in the United States, they use the FEMA floodplain and the FEMA flood elevations to run their program. And that's the existing conditions, that more narrow floodplain that I showed you on the floodplain map. But the city made the decision back in 2004 to try to predict the future, how wide and how high is the future floodplain going to be. And so that's an example of a higher standard that the city is allowed to make that choice and to regulate using the future conditions. And so, yeah, we can, the city can and does have higher standards in this ordinance.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions. I think we can.
Andrew, this is Josh. There was a question about when greenway dedication is required, and it's more than just conditional rezonings. If a subdivision is coming in that has area within the floodplain and it's part of a greenway master plan, then that area can be requested from the county to be dedicated. So it's more than just conditional rezonings, and that's a current requirement. And as far as I know, it's carrying through into the UDO.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Unless there's any other questions, we can move on to soil erosion and sedimentation with Jay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is Jay Wilson, also with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, and I'm in charge of Chapter 17 and the Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control Ordinance. We'll talk about some of the background stuff, and I think it's going to be a similar bent as the previous presentations. There's a lot of administrative type changes and updates, but nothing too substantive. But we'll kind of go ahead and get into it now. As a background or introduction for those of you who may not be as familiar with Chapter 17, I think it's worth pointing out that the city's Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control Ordinance, or SESCO, is a delegated state authority. So this is all derived from the authority of the Sedimentation Pollution Control Act of the early 70s. And the state delegates that authority out to local programs or municipalities, jurisdictions that request that. And as a larger jurisdiction, it is also a component of the city's MS4 stormwater management permit, as Jordan mentioned earlier on. As a result of that delegated authority, the state also maintains a concurrent regulatory authority and jurisdiction. And so, as Mr. Cooksey had asked earlier, there's sometimes some questions about which rules may apply and where we may or may not be more restrictive. It is not permitted, though, for the local ordinance in Charlotte or anywhere else to be less stringent or less restrictive than the state Sedimentation Pollution Control Act. So, and I think in the case of Charlotte's ordinance, we don't have that problem. I think that due to the strength of our existing ordinance, we're really seeing minimal consequential changes proposed. And they primarily relate to changes in state law and changes in the state's general permit for construction site stormwater runoff. That's the NCG 01 for folks that may be familiar or want to get more information. The state issues a general permit coverage for activities related to construction and land disturbing activity. Any changes that we propose and that are going to be adopted by the city have to be reviewed and approved by a state commission, the State Sedimentation Control Commission. And that's really where that test happens, as to whether the more restrictive elements are allowed to be entered as the local ordinance. So the final draft will go to the State Sedimentation Control Commission for approval. And they have the authority to require revisions or ask for changes or bless any revisions or changes we might propose. So as a general outline of Chapter 17, this is really intended to be fairly high level. And if you have any specific questions, please let us know at the end. But as a general rule, the erosion control ordinance applies to all land disturbing activities. The primary objective of the ordinance is to minimize and control significant sedimentation, significant off-site sedimentation. As a general rule, projects 1 or more acres, they must have an approved civil site plan to go along with their activity. But all private land disturbing activities are subject to the ordinance and must comply with the requirements set forth in Chapter 17. It also includes penalties for failure to comply and processes to ensure that compliance. And also there's in the ordinance section that outlines appeals to the quasi-judicial board, which is the Stormwater Advisory Committee, or SWAC. For those of you who may not have seen that before, and that is the, as David mentioned, the advisory committee set to help guide and direct the city and county stormwater utility. And because of that concurrent jurisdiction with the state, there's by state law also ability for folks to appeal to the state level as well. We usually are able to avoid that with here in our jurisdiction, but that's always a possibility and something that's allowed by the law and the ordinance. So I thought it'd be useful just to kind of cover what land disturbing activity is. And this is a definition that's in the ordinance, and it's fairly uniform across the state, but it's in a nutshell, any use of the land by any person that results in a change in the ground cover or topography that can cause or contribute to sedimentation. So I have a kind of list of land disturbing activities and some that may not be land disturbing activities here in the slide. As you can see, of course, things related to development, the purpose of this advisory committee and the UDO, grading and excavation and construction, generally are always considered land disturbing activity. Some of the lesser known things are like removal of vegetation in any level, and that's a ground level vegetation. So something as simple as blading up a pasture or turf lawn could be considered a land disturbing activity. Removal of trees, if that's the primary ground cover is considered a land disturbing activity. And then sometimes operations like demolition can be considered a land disturbing activity, and it really comes down to whether or not they are uncovering the mineral soil surface below whatever structure is being demolished. Some activities that aren't necessarily a land disturbing activity are a mill and overlay of an existing parking lot. So even though activities like that can generate stormwater pollutants, it's not necessarily something that's regulated by our ordinance. I have demolition there in both columns, I guess you probably noticed, and that's to kind of recognize that some demolition activities can take place without land disturbing activity. If someone is working from a hardened surface like a parking lot and removing a metal building on a concrete slab, they may be able to remove that entire building and leaving the slab in place and not result in any change in ground cover that could cause or contribute to sedimentation. So it isn't always considered land disturbing activities. And then in a certain sense, some common sense activities aren't really subject. If your neighbor's widening their driveway by 3 feet, and they come in on a Thursday afternoon and grade a small area and pour a driveway on a Friday and landscape on the next week, that's not really something we would normally seek to regulate, although technically it could be considered land disturbing. Small activities or activities that are not likely to result in any significant impact are generally ignored. And there are some activities that are completely exempted by the local and state requirements. That's forestry operations. They enjoy strong state and federal protections, as well as agricultural uses. Emergency operations, when property or human health is threatened or in danger, there's no requirements under the ordinance. And then an important distinction between the local ordinance and the state's law is that any activities over which the state has sole regulatory jurisdiction are not able to be permitted or regulated by the city. And that would be things like road construction, activities, governmental construction, the building of schools, railroads, almost any entity with the right of eminent domain, like utilities, are under the state's sole regulatory jurisdiction, as well as mining activities. So if the site requires a mining permit, that would not be regulated by the local ordinance. In an attempt to minimize and prevent sedimentation damage to the city's stormwater sewer system, private properties, and perhaps most importantly, in my opinion, surface waters of the state, there are some general requirements set forth in the ordinance. The city's ordinance is a little above and beyond from the state requirement in that it does require controls on any land disturbing activity. So any activity or all activities subject to the ordinance must plan their activities in a manner to minimize sedimentation impacts. That can be things like identifying critical areas, limiting amount of exposure and time of exposure, control of stormwater runoff and management of stormwater runoff and sedimentation. That's kind of the planning side. And then when it comes right down to the brass tacks, it has to work. So really, it's a performance-based ordinance, and a well-planned and compliant activity inspects regularly for performance. Sometimes when off-site damages do occur or measures aren't working optimally, it may be it may be prudent or necessary for the land disturber, the responsible party, to remove or mitigate damage if present, and that's enshrined in the ordinance. And of course, they need to maintain those measures that are required to control sedimentation in working order throughout the duration of that construction activity. Activities that are 1 acre or greater enjoy a more restrictive level of requirements, and essentially they have to kind of follow all items in column 1. In addition to that, they have to submit a civil site plan with their construction site stormwater management plan captured on that plan. that plan has to be reviewed and approved by the city. And upon approval, they are permitted to commence activity. The ordinance requires a pre-construction conference, a meeting to begin before commencement of activity to review the requirements of the civil site plan. And in addition to everything else, the sites that are 1 acre or more have to maintain records of their self-inspection. So any activity has to do regular inspections and maintenance, and the larger activities have to maintain records of those self-inspections. The potential key changes in Chapter 17 are, I would say, not exhaustive. A lot of the changes we're proposing are really to kind of update the ordinance to show some changes that have happened with state law. There's been some changes in recent years to provide additional protections for first-time violators. Again, it's at the state level, duty to provide assistance for folks that are in violation of the ordinance. There's capped penalties for first-time violators. There's some changes at state law for transfer of plans and transfer of ownership and responsibility for existing approved plans. And the state kind of added some additional exempted activities, and specifically that relates to wetlands and the establishment of mitigation banks, and that primarily pertains to folks down east. We don't see a lot of wetland mitigation banks operating in Mecklenburg outside of the ones that we do internally. We also have proposed some changes to capture some elements of the state's stormwater permit. The NCG01, as I mentioned earlier, is the state's general permit to regulate construction site stormwater in activities on those sites. We found that where we can be consistent with other requirements, that we generally can expect better results when the regulated community kind of knows what the standards are and has a more uniform standard to follow. And in that same vein, that's another reason we're really proposing minimal changes to our existing ordinance, is that it's easier to follow the known rules and to learn a new set and test the limits of those in appeals or superior court. So we're trying to kind of pick up some of the common sense stuff from the state's new permit with some of these key changes. Some of those other changes continued. This is really in line with some of the other sections. There's been some structural changes to make the ordinance a little easier to read and follow, and or jump from section to section and find the things that you might need, in the spirit of the entire Unified Development Ordinance to make it a little more user friendly. In that process, we're normalizing language, trying to identify definitions and other features that might be uniform across other stormwater ordinances or sections with the natural resource or other ordinances within the natural resource section. And then, anytime you crack into the ordinance, I think it's a good idea to look at it for redundant or conflicting requirements, and we've tried to clean those up where they may have occurred, and it really was very minimal in this particular instance. And that's pretty much everything from a fairly high level on soil erosion sediment control. Glad to take any questions if you have any.
Thanks, Jay. Any other questions? I did answer Matt's question. We can come back to it if Matt, you have any other follow-up after my response, but are there any other questions that weren't submitted through the chat? As maybe folks are thinking, or what, did I hear somebody? Yeah,
Andrew, could you go over Matt's question? Because I thought it was a good one, and I also thought your response was good in case not everybody has seen it.
Yeah, so Matt asked if there will be a red line version of these ordinances provided, showing sort of what was stricken out, what was replaced, all that stuff. Kind of like what you'd see in a Word document if you track changes. We we generally do not plan to provide those, just because the way that the articles have been reworked to be fit into the UDO. There's been a lot of reorganization and reformatting that results in a lot of markup that in the end, the content of the standards didn't change too much, but the amount of sort of movement of the different components results in just kind of mass confusion when you read the document. And you know, we may be able to make some of that available, but I think we're thinking through how to best communicate that, and maybe through some short sort of like webinar style videos where we can walk through changes. It may be through, you know, some more tailored content so that people can actually understand what we did. What we don't want to do is we don't want to be, you know, communicating and sending out materials that just confuse people and ultimately make it less accessible for the general public to understand what's going on. So we're trying to find that balance, and definitely appreciate Matt's concern there. But Matt, if you have anything else to add, feel free to jump in. Hearing no comments or other questions, we can move on. I guess, do you want me to take this? While I'm talking, I'll just jump in. Our next meeting is going to be on April 29th, and we're going to discuss the remaining stormwater standards. We will send more information on that in the coming weeks as we develop presentations and the content, but keep an eye out for that meeting invite. I will say that as we were presenting this material, it occurred to us that, you know, that it would be a really good resource to maybe do a summary, a high-level summary of sort of what is changing, and maybe create some written bullet points and some summaries that can add to what we presented today, just to give everybody sort of more of a written record of what's being changed. And we will certainly work on that and provide that hopefully before the next meeting, but we may just end up providing that at the end of, once we get done with all of our stormwater articles. So just looking to provide you guys some more resources to understand these things. Something, you know, a lot of these things you don't interact with on a daily basis, although some of you do. The goal is to really make sure that everybody understands what we're doing, and yeah, so we'll be sending some more information on that in the coming weeks.
Andrew, I would just add, if there is anyone who, like, wow, this was a lot of information, couldn't quite get my head around it, but has questions or wants to sit down and talk with Andrew and the team, we can certainly arrange that. We know that for those of us who do not work in stormwater daily, when you get into the technical aspects of the ordinances, it can be a lot to understand. And so folks who want to dig into it, we will be available to help explain the way that these things are regulated currently.
Right. There were two comments. One is about the stormwater stuff, and one is about general schedule from Eric, but I think it's all from Derek Dittner. It seems that not all the changes are required, or that most of the changes are required, and there's little room for adjustment. Is that accurate? I think from my understanding, that's the case, but I think the intent of these meetings is to summarize what we're changing. And if there is something in the ordinance today that maybe is a little bit clunky, or, you know, something that we might not even be thinking about, those sorts of comments are acceptable too. We're not opposed to considering sort of other changes to these ordinances, or what they'll be articles when they are in the UDO. But I think by and large, what we're proposing in these 4 articles are really kind of required and clarification amendments. But I'll open it up to David, Jordan, and Jay if you have any other comments to add to that.
I don't mind kind of speaking up a little bit, Andrew. I think it's a good question. You know, I think that we're looking at these meetings as a chance for the general. I think we consider you folks the stakeholders in this process, and if there's changes that are being looked at or are expected by the community, I think this is the venue for those kind of things to come in. As administrators and regulators, it's a tough, it's a tightrope to walk. It's not necessarily in our purview to look at, going above and beyond, especially in this case of my ordinance. I feel like I have a very strong ordinance. So, I'm hoping that through the committee process, that if there's other changes that we should consider, that, those will be brought to our attention, and we're certainly happy to consider those, or at least I am. I don't want to speak for Jordan and Mr. Goo.
Yeah, I could say for the two that I shared today, it's similar to what Jay said. I mean, and to the question from Warren earlier too, sometimes the state law is the ceiling and sometimes it's the floor, or at least the floor in all cases. So yeah, I mean, if anybody has any recommendations or something that they are intimately familiar with these ordinances and they have something that's bugged them for the past 22 years, please let us know. Sure. We can look into it. And if we're, if it's something that we do have the authority to be more restrictive than the state in some regard, then we can look into that, or at least let you know whether we can. So yeah, similar to what Jay said, we're mostly doing cleanup with these two, but if y'all have got some changes that you'd like to propose, we can surely look at them and, get back to you.
I would agree with Jordan and Jay. For the floodplain ordinance, there's a minimum ordinance that we have to adopt that complies with the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. But above that, I would definitely be interested in any having a discussion about any provision in the ordinance if you had ideas about that. Because in our case, we can go above the minimum standard. We can't go below the minimum standard. And so so a lot of the ordinance is at the minimum standard, but there are some provisions in there that are above the minimum standard.
Awesome. Thank you. Laura, do you want to take on schedule?
Yeah, and I think then Warren Cooksey's has an interesting approach that we could maybe possibly look at for the next meeting. So schedule, I think Eric Severell had asked a question about our schedule. Let me tell you what we have so far. So obviously in 2 weeks, we will be back to discuss additional stormwater standards. And then on the 6th of May, we'll be talking about the tree regulations. On the 20th of May, and we can send this out in the follow-up, we'll begin discussion on subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. And I think we're looking at whether the 27th works just with holiday schedules or whether we should go to the next week to continue the discussion on subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. But I think we can kind of get you through what to expect through the 20th, and we'll talk about additional dates for subdivision, streets, and infrastructure, and give you that. So we'll at least get to that part. I think after that, we'll be coming back to a few more zoning related items, and then looking at administration for the UDO. Our intention is within a month to 2 months of the comprehensive plan being adopted to release a draft of the full UDO. We've heard from folks they're anxious to see this, and we understand that. And we've also heard folks say it's hard to assess anything without seeing everything together. So we'll be getting that together. While we'll be putting out the draft to the public, we'll continue working with the Ordinance Advisory Committee to get the feedback from the committee on your thoughts on the UDO. And also, sorry, I have a cat here who every time I talk wants to come over. So in addition to that, we'll be bringing you all what the public is saying and gathering your comments and working through to a draft that will go to public hearings. So we'll continue and have lots of opportunities, and we're really trying to kind of get feedback on initial concepts so far in advance of putting a full draft together. We certainly don't want to put a full draft together, get it out to you guys, and have you say, oh, wow, we don't think some of this works. But we also want to make sure you know that you will have additional opportunities after the draft as well. Thank you.
Yep, that's great. While we have some time, we can take on Warren's follow-up question. You know, getting back to the federal and state standards, there are those standards, and then there are standards in existing city ordinances previously adopted by City Council. Are there any changes being proposed during the transfer of existing ordinances to the UDO? I don't know if I fully understand the question.
Yeah, Warren, are you able to chime in and maybe expound a little bit on that?
Happy to. So for example, previous response to my question pointed out that the minimum standard on FEMA floodplain is present, something along those, if I understood it correctly, but about 2004, if I remember correctly, the then City Council adopted principles of trying to anticipate future as well. So that was going above the minimum required. So that's baked into the existing floodplain ordinance for the city of Charlotte to try to look to the future, not simply stick with the present, which is the minimum federal standard. So my question is, as we are, we're part of this process to prepare transferring these various stormwater and floodplain ordinances from their current locations into the UDO. Are there any changes to the standards being proposed along with those, with the language to do the transfer? I hope that clarified it. Another way of phrasing it is what's being discussed today and next time simply a kind of a near as possible one-to-one transfer of existing ordinances into the unified development ordinance, or are there some changes being proposed to local standards that are coming with the transfer?
And I'll open it up to anybody, any of the administrators that want to take that on. But yeah, I mean, kind of what you're talking about is, and I heard somebody say this yesterday, if we just took all the different ordinances and stacked them together and stapled them, you'd have a UDO, right? But that's not exactly just what we're doing. There are, there are clarifications, there are all sorts of changes that are being made to make the ordinances more clear and also really easier to use. I go back to Jordan's example of taking text and putting it in a table. You'll see that I think when you look at those articles, there's a lot of improvements that aren't just taking the current text and transferring it to the UDO. There are also some things like definitions that will be moved to general definitions in the UDO as opposed to staying in the separate articles. Now, floodplain is really the exception to that. Floodplain has a lot of really specific definitions that are going to stay in that article. But for a lot of the other stuff, we're really trying to align definitions so that there isn't 3 definitions for building and there isn't 3 different, definitions for built upon area. I mean, there are some that are going to stay the same, and we're in the process of thinking through that. But that's another example of something that's going to probably change and not just get transferred over one for one. But I'll open it up to Jay, David, and Jordan if they have any other things that come to mind.
Andrew, could I ask Warren a kind of clarifying question? I'm assuming, Warren, that what you're talking about is if the maximum of something is 8 right now, where are we changing it from 8? Where's the specific standard changing as opposed to kind of the cleanup and the unifying portion of that? Is that correct?
It's a broader question. Is anything like that happening?
Right.
When Andrew was reviewing, I do recall, at the beginning of the presentation, there was this discussion about the definitions, the discussion of dropping some exemptions that no longer make sense, things of that sort. But I think given the technical nature of these topics in particular, and the overall theme of the OAC work has been, here's what we're changing to land use ordinances to conform with what we want for the future. Well, these are technical topics that we know we're constrained on, and that there have been a lot adopted in the past. For the benefit of me or this committee, what kind of standards, if any, are being proposed to be changed during the transfer? You know, definitions are one thing, that's a cleanup. But so, for example, if in 2004 council hadn't said we'd like our floodplain maps to take account the future as well as the present, that would be something that could be changed during this process. Is, you know, while the ordinances were being converted over, we might be having that conversation now, if it hadn't been done 17 years ago, to say, well, is it good enough to go with the minimum, or should we do more? My question focuses on, of all that we've seen today and we'll see next go round, is there anything being proposed that alters previously adopted local standards that exceed or within the discretion of the city?
I don't mind kind of jumping in here. So in the case of the Chapter 17, the Soil Erosion Sedimentation Control Ordinance, you know, for a long time, the city's ordinance was, in my opinion, a leader across the state. So certainly much more restrictive than the minimum state standard. So, you know, in the case of Chapter 17, it's not a matter of being at the floor and staying at the floor. I think in a lot of ways, you know, we're looking at staying with our improved standards and trying to ensure that the other systems that are kind of being baked into the rest of the UDO continue to play nicely with those enhanced standards. So not specifically with my ordinance. I know there's some other sections that are, you know, proposing additional standards, or I shouldn't say additional standards, but standards that you know, haven't perhaps been in place up to date. But you know, with Chapter 17, it's really at this point in time trying to, you know, maintain the high level of regulation that we have now. And as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, you know, anytime we crack open the ordinance, or at least with Chapter 17, it's potential danger, because we have to go to the state for approval for that. So it's really, you know, not known what the outcome might be. We might go to the state and they might say we're asking for too much, or maybe they'll say we're not asking for enough in some place. I don't see where that would be. So specifically with Chapter 17, there are some changes that could be considered changes to minimum standards or minimum practices, and I think that is in line with how we've sought to administer soil erosion and sedimentation control historically, and you know, they're kind of a commensurate change with changes in state law and state requirement. So I think the answer is yes and no. You know, the existing ordinance is already pretty stringent, but we haven't sought to go far above and beyond that, because, you know, frankly, you know, I don't know if you've seen if you're keeping up with, you know, what happens in the General Assembly, but you know, there's it seems like oftentimes there are bills passed and laws passed specifically to you know, hammer down folks that get too ambitious. Now that doesn't mean that me personally, I'm opposed to doing that sort of thing, but certainly you want the support of, you know, the community and leadership before a kind of a unilateral you know, step into oncoming traffic, so to speak.
Hey, Warren, this is Daryl Hammock with Stormwater Services, and thanks for that question. I thought it was intriguing, and I kind of want to jump in here for just a second. You know, of what we've heard today, I would say that probably one of the more significant changes has to do with the freeboard requirement that David Good explained. I don't think it's a very incremental thing. It's a very small thing, but it is one of the more significant things that we've talked about today in terms of definition changes and alignment, things like that. And the public policy decision is, does Charlotte want to reduce flood-prone structures in the future, or increase flood-prone structures in the future? And so, you know, along that goes with things like increased flood insurance rates, you know, maybe blighted properties that are flood-prone and flooded. And so I think what we would recommend, you know, in that particular case, it is a policy decision to increase the freeboard. And that is why we went through a stakeholder process 2 or 3 years ago. We got a lot of input and feedback on that, and David described that. And so that's one of the things I think that I would draw your attention to as being a policy decision that council could make. We could go more protective or less protective on that.
Thank you. And this has been helpful, because one of the challenges of this is it is so technical and it is so restrictive. It's sometimes easy to get lost in it. And so I appreciate the responses that clarify that a lot of what we're doing is we're transferring over, but in that particular case, like you mentioned, Daryl, this is an opportunity to implement a change as well. Because I think one of the things that would be bad to happen is if there's too much of a perception of this is simply trying to transfer existing to the UDO format, only to learn afterwards, well, there were some policy changes too. So highlighting what those policy changes would be, even if they're minimal, I think is a good thing for everybody. So appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that might be a good call out as we write up summaries of this, just to have a little blurb, say what quantitative, what numbers, standards changed. So we appreciate that. The next question I see is from Ismail. Have you all looked at the UDO passed in Asheville as a potential example or guide for drafting the document? Laura,
Andrew,
Allen, yeah,
I'll take that one. We are working with Camaris and have Arista Strungus and Chris Jeanette on here, who have worked on a number of UDOs and are familiar with a number of them throughout the country. So we worked with them to develop the approach format outline for the UDO. And I want to turn it over to Arista or Chris to just give a little bit of your perspective on kind of the way we're arranging this and what you've done in other communities. And if you have looked specifically at Asheville, that's great, but otherwise kind of the general approach.
Well, hello. Yeah, I would say we haven't looked specifically at Asheville, but if anybody brings up something that they've seen within the Asheville code that they like or think is applicable, and really anywhere in the country that you're looking at UDOs and UDCs, we're very happy to take a look at that and see how it applies. We typically draw on our experience. We've been, I've been working in zoning for over 20 years now and have done a number of UDOs. One of the more recent ones is in Buffalo, New York. We did a form-based UDO there. So what we're doing is looking at the issues that are happening here in Charlotte and then crafting responses based on the experience that we see, how this best can be addressed here. So it's really, you never, when you want to approach a new UDO process, you don't start it by saying, they did a good code, so we're just going to take it and model it after that. It's got to be very particular to the city that you're working in, and making sure that you're crafting things in relation to, how things operate in Charlotte. But again, we're happy if somebody sees something that they like someplace else, we're happy to take a look at it and see if it's applicable. It's something that we're always looking to get more kind of input and see what others are doing. It's just part of the field as a whole.
Thank you, Arista. Hand it back to Andrew. Additional questions?
Just wanted to say, appreciate your comment, the comment from Eric about the standards. We certainly understand the changing weather patterns and climate change, and want to make sure that we're ensuring the appropriate development for the future. So, and I will also say, as we've been working on these standards, all these folks on the stormwater side, often reference conversations they've had with other cities in North Carolina. And so I think in general, the approaches and the ways that we look at, updating our standards are based in peer cities and from that perspective too. So something we're very cognizant of, and just want to make sure everybody knows we are keeping our head out of the sand, and we're looking around at what other cities are doing, and kind of like what Arista said, just making sure it's the right fit for Charlotte. So So I don't see any other questions or comments. Feel free to connect with us offline. We'd be glad to set up some more time to engage with anybody who either was on this call or wasn't on this call to talk about any other concerns. But thank you to everybody that submitted questions today. And I think I'll turn it either back to Laura or Allison.
Allison, I think you're closing out.
Yep, I think so, unless I just want to make, I don't see Ty on anymore.
I think
But
I think you have to.
okay. Well, just thanks everyone. Appreciate your feedback and discussion today, and sounds like we'll get you some updated information soon. And otherwise, look forward to seeing everyone in a couple weeks for some more stormwater. So thank you again for your participation and being part of this group, and we'll see you soon.